Alright everyone, this is a big one. This is a ranking I've been meaning to put together for some time now, but I've always been apprehensive about it. And that's ranking every story arc of the Bleach manga from worst to best. After all, everyone's favourite story arc of Bleach is going to be different for one reason or another. More so then than any other ranking, this feels like a truly personal one. Everyone's experience with Bleach, with the story of Bleach, with which parts of the story they enjoy the most for whatever reason, will be totally different from person to person. And then of course there's the issue that, well, there just aren't any story arcs in Bleach that I don't like. You also know, though, that whichever arc you place at the bottom of the list will invariably be somebody's favourite out there. And that's both unfortunate and awesome because it shows how wide-reaching the appeal of the story is. The trickiest question I had was how to approach the ranking. After all, I'd say there are really only 5 core story arcs in the Bleach manga: Agent of the Shinigami, the Soul Society arc, the Rankar arc, the Lost Agent arc, and of course the Thousand Year Blood War arc. No, we're not counting the Hell arc just yet, but hopefully one day. That being said, for the longest time the community has split the various arcs into sub-arcs. For example, turning the enormous Arankar arc into the more digestible Arankar Invasion, Waco Mundo, and Fake Karakura Town arcs. And then of course you can go even more granular than that, with the inclusion of the even smaller arcs, such as Turn Back the Pendulum, Deicide, and Everything But the Rain, or separating out sequences like the first Quincy invasion, for example. Things get muddier still when you consider even smaller potential sub-arcs too, things like The Lust or The Headless Star, sequences of chapters with the same title, which each convey an important event at the time, usually surrounding Ichigo. There's a lot going on, so today we're keeping it simple. I'll be ranking the 5 core story arcs, but we'll be going pretty in-depth. This is going to be a fairly long video, I think. I want to give a detailed account of how I feel about each one, taking an all-encompassing holistic view of the 5 of them, meaning they'll be applauded for their strengths and fairly docked points for their weaknesses, with each arc being presented as a complete package. If you guys would like to see a much more granular ranking of the arcs, ranking those aforementioned sub-arcs, then do please let me know, and I'm sure we can make that happen in the future too. And of course, crucially, this list is entirely subjective. Make sure to let me know your favourite arcs of Bleach down in the comments. And of course, before we get started on the video, guys, consider hitting subscribe, especially if you enjoyed today's video and you want to see more just like that. Maybe you're new here or you haven't yet hit that button. Either way, your support would be greatly appreciated. And the same goes for my other channel as well, Mr. Tomo Talks Games, where we have been growing pretty nicely over there. And again, a massive thank you goes out to all of you who are new subscribers over there. It is being noticed. It is having a noticeable impact, and I really do appreciate it. Okay, so first up we have, well, the very first arc of Bleach, the Agent of the Shinigami arc, which runs from chapter 1 through to chapter 69, so certainly not the longest arc of the series. And you know, I do feel kind of bad placing the Agent of the Shinigami arc at the bottom here. Again, there isn't a single arc I dislike in Bleach, but this very first arc definitely has a different vibe. And while there's plenty to love about the overall lighter feel and tone of this first arc, which mostly deals with Ichigo and Rukia's Monster of the Week shenanigans as we are slowly introduced to the main cast, for me personally, as a reader, I've always much preferred the darker, more mature side of Bleach. I like it when the stakes are a lot higher, when there's more going on, more characters, and the world feels much bigger. Agent of the Shinigami, really through no fault of its own, is essentially the antithesis of that. At this point in the story, we've not yet been introduced to that wider world. And that makes sense. There are some teases here and there of what might lie beyond the veil, the existence of Shinigami and the Soul Society itself. Obviously, Kisuke Urahara being introduced as this very mysterious character is cool, but for the most part, this is an arc that's wholeheartedly about Ichigo, about Rukia, and their friends in Karakura Town, their wacky adventures. It's an arc about Ichigo getting to grips with this new world that he's about to explore, with his new Shinigami powers, and with establishing the ever-present threat of the Hollows, with Ichigo and the gang coming up against a new enemy every few chapters or so. Alongside, of course, the absolutely necessary introduction of characters like Orihime, Chad, and Uryu, it can kind of feel like, even in this early stage, that the story is spinning its wheels a little bit, with the introduction of characters like Don Kanoji, for example, through their various stories, but it is all heading to a satisfying climax. And when we get there, when the doors are suddenly thrown open and that wider world comes crashing into Ichigo's own with the arrival of Byakuya and Renji, it is very effective and never really lets up after that. I've known people who I've tried to get into this series to have fallen off of Bleach because of this first arc. And I do get it to some degree. This staggered approach to the storytelling can feel slow, and ultimately I don't think the Agent of the Shinigami arc is wholly representative of what Bleach becomes, what Bleach mostly is. And, at least in my opinion, it is also simply the least interesting part of the story. But it's also got so much value to it as well. Although many of them are just starting out on their respective journeys, there is a lot of depth here. And despite the first arc's overall lighter, more comedic tone, it does manage to deal in some truly darker sequences, some storylines that do feel like they manage to bring the stakes. Watching Orihime's powers manifest themselves as she tries to protect Tatsuki is an emotionally resonant moment that works really well, as does the tragic story of her brother Sora. Uryu's entire contest with Ichigo, which of course spirals out of control and in some way lays the groundwork for the very final arc of the story, is a great way to build a crescendo to the arc's ultimate confrontation. Chad's story, where he's attempting to save the soul of a small child from a particularly monstrous hollow, is maybe his most compelling narrative arc of the entire series. Hell, even the introduction of Kon, who would later go on to be nothing more than a comedic foil, he becomes a very two-dimensional character. Here, his story is tinged by darkness, and a depth you would never know without first reading this initial story arc. And of course there is Ichigo himself, who is the beating heart and soul of this first arc, who undergoes some wonderful characterization here. Honestly, the Agent of the Shinigami arc is probably the most like a real person Ichigo ever feels, as he deals with complex emotions, devastating guilt, and more. His battle with Grand Fisher is the absolute highlight of the arc, though watching him train with Kisuke at the very end is also fantastic. As is his first meeting with the Shinigami, the catalyst for the remainder of the story to come. Speaking of Grand Fisher, this is the only arc where regular low-level hollows successfully feel like threats. And of course their drop-off in relevance over time makes sense, and it comes about naturally thanks to the progression and development of our characters. But there is something novel too about them being the big bads here, and of course their various designs are awesome. So yeah, like I said, I feel kind of weird putting the first arc at the bottom of the list, but it just goes to show that, at least for me, it's only getting even better from here on out. Agent of the Shinigami serves as an interesting jumping off point, a fascinating introduction to the world of Bleach. It's a little slow, in places the stakes feel low, and the emphasis on light-hearted tomfoolery combined with Kubo's distinctly older, more abrasive, though still wonderful art style, does put it in 5th place for me. But there is plenty to love here, and when the arc hits its biggest emotional beats, it does so expertly, which is all the more impressive for such a nascent story. Moving on, in 4th place we have the Lost Agent arc, which runs from chapter 424 to chapter 479. And really, we have already reached the point where from this moment forth, I absolutely unequivocally love all 4 of these remaining arcs, but this is without a doubt the most polarizing arc of Bleach, and I would say for good reason. Following up the Urankar arc was always going to be a Herculean task, and for many people, this is where Bleach died. If you weren't a part of the community during this time, if you weren't reading it weekly, engaging on the forums, it is impossible to truly know and truly understand what it was like, especially since the narrative has changed so much these days. But for the first half or so of this arc, I just remember how hard it felt to be a genuine enjoyer of the Lost Agent arc, because it felt like it was suffering from nothing but relentless hate, and that to enjoy what the arc was putting forward, well, you must have been in the wrong. And there's no doubt that this is Bleach at its weirdest for some totally unexpected reasons. The Lost Agent arc has been described many times over as filler in canon manga form, and while I've never agreed with that perspective, there is no doubt that this arc is experimental. This is Kubo coming off the back of the longest arc of his story, an arc which, certainly by the end, was defined by pretty much nothing but constant fighting, and so is really trying something new. This is a fresh start, time skip and all. And the result of that is a down-to-earth, street-level, to borrow comic terminology, noir-style mystery thriller. And if that sounds weird in the context of Bleach, that's because it was. People were very excited and just a little apprehensive to see where the series was headed in the wake of Aizen's defeat. Again, another very common, very popular phrase was to say that Bleach should have ended when Aizen was defeated, which again I can kind of see where people are coming from a purely outsider perspective, but I mean I couldn't agree less with that sentiment. But ultimately I think a lot of people were left disappointed by the direction the story went in. Also, almost an entire arc without the Shinigami, who certainly by this point were the uncontested stars of the series, was a bold and daring move for the author to make. I'm very happy, though, to see that public opinion on the Lost Agent arc has improved dramatically in the years that have followed, and in that sense I feel vindicated in a way. This is also the shortest arc of the series as well, which doesn't help matters, to be honest. There is less ground to cover, fewer characters involved, and we are kind of back to that fundamental Agent of the Shinigami scope, albeit now with a much darker, more mature vibe, which I prefer. And don't get me wrong, this is a very dark story arc, surprisingly so. That friendship group that was built up to be the focus during the Agent of the Shinigami arc and was then fortified over the course of the following arcs is now once again the focus of the story, but it has now been fractured completely. In the wake of Ichigo losing his powers and the almost 2 years following Aizen's defeat, everyone has kind of tried to lead a normal life, but there's no going back. Ichigo has become paranoid, he's become terrified of his own helplessness, and when sinister forces start to close in once again, he grows desperate. Speaking of sinister forces, execution is another factor of this arc that has come under severe scrutiny over the years, with people considering them to be nothing more than a lazy rehash of the Vizards, only less interesting. For me, it's a tale of two halves. I don't think there's anything lazy about execution, but I also don't think characters like Giriko or Jackie, or even really Shishigiwara, are particularly memorable or compelling. But on the other hand, I've gone on record before saying that Ginjo and Tsukishima are two of my favourite characters, not just from this arc, but from the entire series. The character dynamics that really matter in this arc are handled extremely well. Ichigo's newfound yet rocky relationship with Ginjo is a highlight of the series, frankly, while his strained relationships with Chad and Orihime are painful to watch. When Ichigo begins to distrust even those closest to him, as shown in standout chapters like Spotlight Brocken, his entire world collapses. While the twist reveal of Ginjo's true nature is maybe a little predictable, I can't help but admire the writing in this arc. It's tight and well plotted, with numerous instances of some genuinely clever moments looping back around as everything comes to a head. Tsukishima's power Book of the End is one of the most terrifying abilities ever cooked up in Bleach. Not only does it make for a smart narrative device, but it leads to perhaps the craziest showdown in Bleach's history when Ichigo's friends and family turn on him, resulting in the most intimate and personal destruction of his world and character ever. We always thought that Ichigo's closest family and friends in the human world would be untouchable, the likes of his sisters, for example, and this arc proves that they are not. Seriously, I was taken aback. When I say it's like something out of a horror movie, I mean it. This is unlike anything else in the series, and I value that greatly. And to complement this, the artwork here in the Lost Agent arc is absolutely top tier. I've said it before, but these are the best faces Kubo has ever drawn, bar none, with pretty much even the smallest of panels being given the utmost care and attention. And maybe it's because there's not as much action, it's less dense overall. The panels in particular do feel sparse in comparison to, say, the Thousand Year Blood War arc, where there is so much going on all the time. But I mean, the sheer quality of the art shines through here in a way that's just completely undeniable. But at the same time, despite my heaping of praise, I am still placing this arc at 4th on the list. And the reasons for that are quite simple. Despite all of the positive qualities of this arc, I just don't see a world where the Lost Agent is realistically capable of offering more of that quintessential Bleach experience, the reasons why I read Bleach that I cherish so much, than the remaining 3 arcs still to come on this list, all of which are so wholeheartedly, so stereotypically Bleach in such an iconic way from start to finish. I love that Kubo tried something new here, he tried something different and fresh, but ultimately the Lost Agent isn't the reason I read Bleach. Not only that, but at least in my opinion, a lot of the new concepts and characters that are introduced here aren't that inspiring. I do think that Fullbring is probably, at least initially, the most convoluted and then the least interesting ability introduced in the series, at least at this late stage anyway, and that, yeah, when you really get down to brass tacks, this arc is just one long training arc for a power that Ichigo ultimately doesn't even really use. His actual Fullbring is stolen from him almost immediately after earning it. I also can't help but think that, more so than any other character, the Lost Agent arc totally fails Chad as a character, because ostensibly this is supposed to be, in quotes, his arc. And although he plays a decent role kind of towards the beginning, he tapers off in the middle of the arc, and then by the end, he is bizarrely completely removed from the final battle in favor of Uryu, and he's knocked out and taken out of the entire story, which is incredibly weird when, for all intents and purposes, this should be his conflict. It's his people, the Fullbringers, who have proven to be the traitors. They have turned against Ichigo and by extension against Chad. They've used Chad. Chad should have something to say and do about that, and he doesn't, because he doesn't get the chance. Yes, it's effective that Tsukishima uses Chad against Ichigo, but the exact same feelings could have been evoked by swapping Chad for Uryu completely, and I think that those two positions could have been switched entirely. Chad could have been the one to come and rescue Ichigo at the end, or, try to rescue him anyway, and then it could have been Ichigo and Chad versus Ginjo, rather than Ichigo and Uryu versus Ginjo, where Uryu, aside from being slashed by Ginjo, I guess, has no stake in this fight whatsoever, really. So that's kind of weird to me, and I think Chad was definitely let down and done dirty by the arc that was supposed to be his. By Kubo's own words, each of the main arcs represents one of Ichigo's friends, and this is supposed to be Chad's. And by the end of it, it sure as hell doesn't feel like it. I also think that while I do love the story and kind of scenario presented here, I think it is built on a flimsy bedrock. All it would have taken was anyone talking to Ichigo and just straight up telling him what was going on to break him out of his funk. Even if the Gotei 13 is testing his loyalty, it could have literally been anyone else. Where's Yoruichi? Or the Vizards, for that matter? The Vizards are in Gigai. There's no reason why they couldn't have just gone and sought Ichigo out. Why would they just suddenly cut off all contact with him simply because he's lost his powers? It makes no sense. And the narrative reason for it is because their intervention would totally break this story wide open. The same goes for characters like Isshin. Isshin is likely not beholden to the same rules that the Gotei 13 are. We know that the Gotei 13 still, for whatever reason, don't really trust Ichigo, and they're concerned about Ginjo approaching him, so they're trying to see what decision he makes. But seriously, it would not have hurt anyone, except for Ginjo and his scheme, to have headed Ichigo off early. Why couldn't Isshin just say to Ichigo, by the way, Kisuke and I, we're working with Rukia, we're going to get your powers back? Again, it's because narratively it would have broken this story wide open, and because, of course, that big reveal makes for a very satisfying twist towards the end. And speaking of the ending, there's the ending, which is where I feel like this arc just cannot win. The Gotei 13, of course, show up for the climactic showdown to battle execution after Ichigo's Shinigami powers are restored, and they, perhaps predictably, roll over the Fullbringers with ease, save for Ginjo and Tsukishima. People were desperate to see the Gotei 13 again for so long, but when they do finally arrive, a lot of the community felt that the ending was a cop-out, and that it was done purely to salvage the story's sinking reputation. When I think you can see it's pretty clear from the get-go that these characters, Execution in particular, have been designed with some aspect of this climax in mind from the off. So yeah, this arc just can't catch a break, no matter what it tries to do. I personally do wish that more had been done with Ginjo, and with the substitute Shinigami plot in general. I kind of think that should have taken precedent over the Fullbring plot, and I'll never forgive Kubo for that tease of Ginjo's past, only to then never reveal it in the manga. But for the most part, I love the weird, experimental nature of this arc. The shadowy, neo-noir nature of this intimate thriller might well be misplaced in Bleach ultimately, but it's enjoyable all the same. Alright, and with that we arrive at really what I would consider the big 3 arcs of Bleach. Generally speaking, I think these are the story arcs that people think of when they think of Bleach, and yeah, ranking them was pretty tough. But in third place, we have the biggest arc of the series, the Rancor arc. Spanning from chapter 183 to chapter 423, which is absurd when you think about it, for many people, the Rancor arc is Bleach. And it makes total sense. This was Bleach at the peak of its powers, at the height of its popularity across the board. Aizen is the most prominent and famous villain of the entire series. The Espada are the single most iconic and popular villainous organization of the series, and this arc features many of Bleach's best battles. So why is it in third? The Rancor arc is a very mixed bag for me when looked at from a top-down perspective, even though, of course, I love it to death. It's clear that the early signs of Kubo's struggles, both as a writer and as a result of his health, are beginning to set in. Not only that, but internal pressures from Shonen Jump to extend the arc beyond Kubo's original vision due to the overwhelming popularity of the Rancor as villains makes this arc feel inorganic in a way. This is also Bleach at its most diluted, its most cookie cutter. You know exactly what you are getting with the Rancor arc from pretty much day one, and it basically never deviates. It stays that course until almost the very end. Things do get genuinely fascinating from time to time. The smaller mini-arcs found within are perhaps the Rancor arc's crowning jewel, the likes of Turn Back the Pendulum or Deicide, for example, and these are where Kubo's writing talents are again allowed to resurface, breathe, and subsequently shine. But much of the rest of the Rancor arc does feel bloated by comparison, drawn out, and at its absolute worst, boring and predictable. But let's start with the good, because there is plenty of it, more than there is bad. And of course we have to begin where else than with the Espada, and the Rancor army in general. They are the most iconic villains of Bleach for a reason, with almost universally excellent designs across the board, including absolute series best favourites like Ulquiorra and Grimjoe, who successfully became totally synonymous with Bleach itself. Every single fight, and that's not hyperbole, every single fight with an Arrancar, and especially the Espada, feels like an event, something the series was simply never able to replicate again. And the Resurrection are also some of Kubo's best design work too. Then there's Ichigo's characterization, his descent into Hollowdom. Despite the more, I would say, muted tone of the arc, there's plenty of real conflict and strife to be found here, specifically between Ichigo and his seemingly monstrous inner hollow, and the battle between the two of them for his soul, that escalates organically throughout the arc as Ichigo reaches ever closer to that dark heart of Waco Mundo, leading of course to one of the series' best ever mini-stories in the Lust. Many of the secondary characters who we've come up with since the start of the story can feel a little sidelined in this arc as the narrative grows ever bigger. Characters like Chad, Uryu and Renji in particular do not get many chances to shine here. But looking back now, it's crazy to see how different of a character Orihime feels throughout this entire arc, in a good way. She really grows here after suffering so much, and it gets kind of bleak at times, and the series feels very human when it deals in real themes of depression, anxiety, and jealousy. Of course, Aizen remains an absolute highlight of the entire series, even if he's not given much to do here outside of, say, the last 50 or so chapters. But he is the recipient of some of Kubo's best writing, in Turn Back the Pendulum, but more so in the Deicide mini-arc, which is a particularly interesting teardown of the character, even if the very final fight does feel a little anticlimactic after hundreds of chapters worth of build-up. Speaking of mini-arcs, Turn Back the Pendulum, set 100 years into the past to reveal the history of Kisuke Urahara among others, is simply one of the best of the series, in a way that almost feels jarring. But it makes for a great and a much needed break in the fighting before the Fate Karakura Town arc really does just become a gauntlet of battles from there until the end. And again, don't get me wrong, I don't hate that, I don't dislike it. I love the Fate Karakura Town arc, but it's definitely not quite as interesting as some of the more plot-heavy sequences of the story. And in regards to Turn Back the Pendulum, the Arrancar arc introduces plenty of new characters into the mix, including the Vizard, former members of the Gotei 13 who were subjected to Aizen's evil experiments and forced to flee after becoming hollowified. While these characters were initially fan favourites that people simply couldn't wait to see in action, really, ever since their performance in the Fate Karakura Town arc, they have been the poster children for wasted potential, and a symbol of the size of the cast of Bleach really beginning to balloon and get away from Kubo a bit. Except for Hachi, of course, who's a certified godkiller. And this arc, I mean, it definitely does feel bloated at times. It feels drawn out, it feels meandering. With the reveal that there would be another final huge arc to come, there's definitely the sense that, again, we are spinning the wheels a bit here, especially towards the end of the arc, with virtually nothing of consequence being revealed. No secrets, no bankai, in service of keeping them for later. Not only that, but at least in my opinion, the early to middle portion of the Waco Mundo arc is by far the weakest portion of the arc. It is a bit of a slog to get through on rereads, and there's no denying that having Orihime be kidnapped feels like a retread of the Soul Society arc, which is all the more frustrating and unnecessary when you just have to look at the Lost Agent and the Thousand Year Blood War arc to see how Kubo is capable of shaking up his overarching plots and making them genuinely more interesting. I think for me, I take a top-down look at the Arrancar arc, I sit back and think, well, what actually happened? This is a point that will come up later, but over the course of 200 plus chapters, the world of Bleach barely changes here. I mean, I won't belabor the point, we've discussed it before, but despite their immense popularity, the Espada and the Irankar are a bit of a wet blanket when it comes to effectiveness, and are basically wiped out by the end of the arc with minimal impact. Now, I don't personally believe that characters need to die for a story to be effective, for a conflict to be effective. But this was supposed to be a big war, really the first in Bleach's narrative, and ultimately to me it's just unrealistic that the good guys win every single fight without incident, essentially. From the smaller Fraction battles to those big Espada fights, the Irankar never pick up really a single win. And even when they do, like for example Po defeating Ikaku, well, that wrong is righted immediately. I'm just saying, you know things are bad when Yamamoto's arm is the biggest casualty of this entire war. But really, again, it's not about character deaths, it's about the world changing around you. It's about us watching historic moments playing out in real time, and the Irankar arc just doesn't really have any of them. Because it's not even just the Espada. Aizen has basically no impact on the overarching world of Bleach in the Irankar arc, which is especially weird when you consider that he has essentially been the driver of the entire story up until now. It's like we slam the brakes on when we come to the Irankar arc and the world enters a state of suspended animation. But like I said, there is much more good here than there is bad. There are some absolutely legendary fights in the Irankar arc, including Ichigo vs Ulquiorra, which may very well be the best fight in Bleach. And of course, I will always harbour a deep love of the Irankar arc, as it's where the series was when I first caught up. In fact, I've said it before that I began reading the manga on a weekly basis around the start of Kenpachi vs Neutra, I think, while the anime had just reached Rukia vs Aranero, so very much in the throes of the arc. This is the arc that really made Bleach what it is in so many ways, and so for that, I'll always be grateful. And I'll always be able to go back to the Irankar arc, open a volume, and have a great time. Some sections of the arc are better than others, for sure, but the package as a whole is a success. And as well, despite its enormous chapter length, the Irankar arc does succeed in hitting those key emotional beats as well, with again, some of the best, most iconic of the entire series. Komamura and Hisagi versus Tosen, which despite the main characters' relative lack of popularity, I've always said, is one of the absolute best fights of the entire series, and the perfect example of Kubo successfully threading the needle when it comes to bringing a story full circle. Then of course there's Gin's ultimate sacrifice, Matsumoto's response to his death at the hands of Aizen, after again Kubo made good on that small moment between those two characters way back at the end of the Soul Society arc. Again, it was very effective. Ulquiorra's death, probably one of the most emotionally resonant moments in all of Bleach. Again, despite the enormous chapter count, it's not like these moments are few and far between. These meaningful moments that add depth and layering to what would otherwise just be a string, a series of near constant battles. It's these moments that give them meaning, and they do resonate when they hit. Yet, that enormous chapter count is a problem for the arc's overall baseline quality. The highs are really high, but the lows do feel like a drag, and as a result I think it perfectly encapsulates what Bleach's middle ground is. Hell, that even translates to the art as well. While the character designs are absolutely top tier, the actual artwork here, the art style, while obviously still totally incredible, my favourite art style of any medium, it isn't really doing anything interesting, like Kubo manages with, I would argue, every other arc. The angular, almost rebellious, punkish nature of the art from the earliest days is now all but completely gone, but it hasn't yet been replaced by the truly stellar art of the Lost Agent or the more mature, detailed chaos of the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Instead, it's settled into what I would consider an inoffensive, slightly rounded off at the edges, middle ground. And look, to be honest, I can totally understand if this is someone's favourite art style in Bleach. It is absolutely the most recognizably Bleach in my opinion, the most well-known, the most prolific, the most consistent of Kubo's art styles, certainly, but I'd argue as well it's the most homogeneous. It's the one where the individual elements stand out the least, in my opinion. And again, I think that makes total sense. This is an arc that lasts for over 200 chapters, even longer than that. It makes total sense to me that Kubo would have found an artwork that works perfectly well for him, that looks amazing, of course, on the outside, and settled into that groove. And all of this combined is why I think third is a fitting spot for the series' biggest arc. I'm expecting people to disagree with me down in the comments, so please, by all means, have at it. For a while, it was popular among detractors of the series to say that Bleach fell off after the Soul Society arc. And while I don't agree with that at all, there's also no denying that in many ways the Soul Society arc is Bleach's truest masterpiece. Spanning from chapter 70 to chapter 182, the Soul Society arc was our first real introduction to the wider world of Bleach, making good on the promises of the Agent of the Shinigami arc, our first real insight into what kind of creativity Kubo truly had in store. The Rancor arc may have been the peak of Bleach's popularity, but that was born out of the immense success of the Soul Society arc and its incredible momentum. With Ichigo and his friends breaking into the Serete to try and save Rukia from execution, there is no other word that best describes this arc than iconic. This is a truly timeless arc of manga, and even today holds up as a superbly written, tightly plotted, and action-packed story, one that does a phenomenal job of introducing us to what would become the single most popular aspect of Bleach, the Gotei 13. And yet, despite the introduction of such an enormous and influential faction, the Soul Society arc manages to continue to feel intimate, and even smaller scale, but with an ever-looming threat hanging overhead to keep a fire lit under our heroes. The iconography of the Soul Society, the Sokyoku Hill, the Senzai-kyu, the uniforms of the Gotei, all of it has become, well, it is Bleach, right to the core. It's here where the series at last finds its footing in a big way and blows the doors wide open to boundless creativity. Battle after battle feels exciting and meaningful, and the art is excellent throughout. It maintains some of the jagged roughness of the Agent of the Shinigami arc, but it's more refined, and arguably hosts some of the best battle sequences Kubo has ever created, with even duels like Ichigo vs Ikkaku simply looking and feeling electrifying. There's so much dynamism here. And speaking of the battles, well, what is there to say that hasn't already been said? The Soul Society arc is written in such a way that the fights here feel purposeful. They all feel useful. This arc is the definition of all killer, no filler. I'm talking Ichigo versus Renji, Ichigo versus Kenpachi, Uryu versus Mayuri, Renji versus Byakuya, Yoruichi versus Soifon, even smaller fights like Chad versus Kyoraku, Hitsugaya versus Gin, or Uryu versus Jirobo, feel like they belong, like they have a place in the narrative, a point to being there, because they do. There aren't really any fights here that take place just for the sake of having a fight. And then of course there's the perennial battle between Ichigo and Byakuya, a fight that has been successfully built towards since the tail end of the first arc, resulting in an immensely satisfying climax really from start to finish. I'll be honest, when it comes to the narrative, Kubo often struggles with endings. You'll notice that for all their strengths, the bigger arcs in the series are the ones where time simply got away. The Rancor arc and the Thousand Year Blood War arc both end abruptly and often without a truly satisfying resolution, but not here. That pitch-perfect plotting comes through right to the very end, from beyond Ichigo's victory over Byakuya, which even successfully teases his inner hollow, but of course to Aizen's wonderful twist reveal as the true villain of the series, the biggest mind-blowing sequence of the entire story, the makings of an iconic enemy, and again one of the craziest, biggest, and perhaps even best executed seismic shifts, twist reveals in the history of the medium. Going back and reading over the Soul Society arc again, this really was Kubo firing on all cylinders like a man with something to prove. There's a dynamism to both the story and the art, an unmistakable style that gives everything an edge, but it's so wonderful to read and soak in as a result. There's nothing quite like the first bankai reveals in the arc, leading up to, of course, the legendary showcase of Ichigo's Tenso Zangetsu for the first time. These are moments that even the casual Bleach reader will likely take with them for a lifetime, that they will likely remember forever. The kind of lightning in a bottle moments that you simply can't replicate, that you simply can't manufacture. They come about as a result of pure, unfettered passion. I really have very little to critique in this arc because it feels like the perfect little story, all wrapped up in just the right amount of spectacle. Unlike the Rankar arc, which, like I said, often feels like it's treading water, the Soul Society arc does an excellent job, I think, of teasing things to come while keeping cards close to its chest without ever being frustrating. And sure, maybe it has the benefit of going first, but for example, Yamamoto unleashing Ryujin Jaka for the first time here feels like an exciting tease, whereas him not using his Bankai in the Fake Karakura Town arc just feels weird, especially considering he was already willing to sacrifice all of his officers to pull off Enet's Jigoku. But crucially, it also means the narrative doesn't really have anything new for Yamamoto to show us until much later on down the line. If I had to levy any criticism towards this arc at all, I'd maybe say that Ichigo's characterization feels a little simplistic here. And there's nothing wrong with him being single-mindedly driven by his one goal of saving Rukia, and it's also cool that he feels like an action hero at times. He definitely steps up into the role of main character in a big way, but it's definitely not as nuanced, layered, or interesting a portrayal as we get in certainly both the Rankar arc and the Lost Agent arc. But I mean, that's pushing it. It doesn't take away from the story. And really, despite coming in second place for me, the Soul Society arc does feel about as close to perfect writing as the series gets. The fact that Kubo managed to keep up that smart plotting for over 100 chapters straight goes to show just how well thought out this was from the beginning, how it naturally leads to such a great conclusion, how that conclusion effortlessly transitions into the next arc. Think about it, the end of the Soul Society arc is really the last time an arc truly, naturally flows into the next one. But yeah, I don't really have much more to say about this arc. I do think it is as close to flawless as Bleach's writing and plotting ever comes. The action is superb and never superfluous, and always feels meaningful and instrumental to the plot. Speaking of the plot, Ichigo and his friends are driven ever forward, while Byakuya looms large as a very effective antagonist, the figurehead of that wider Gotei 13 force. But even that force begins to fracture and fragment, and the internal politicking of the Shinigami remains to this day the most interesting a villain group in Bleach has ever been. With Renji turning against Byakuya in a desperate move to rescue Rukia, while the likes of Kenpachi taking up arms against his fellow captains is really awesome to see. At the same time, captains like Kyoraku and Ukitake turn against the establishment and make moves to stop the execution. It's all just so interesting and so captivating that it lays out the blueprints for the arcs to follow, for plot lines and character dynamics that will be replicated maybe once, but maybe even twice over as the arcs play out. The wider Gotei 13 of the Rankar arc feels like it is on autopilot by comparison. Anyway, that's it for the Soul Society arc. It was pretty positive. So why on earth is it only in second place? I mean, I basically said I think it's nearly perfect from start to finish, and that's true. But this is my subjective list, and there is one arc, yes, even in the manga, that I happen to love just that bit more. And some of you may have seen this coming, but yes, the 1000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach, the final arc, unless the Hell chapter becomes a thing, is my favourite arc of the story. Yes, even the manga version. Is the Thousand Year Blood War arc perfect? Clearly not, hence the enormous amount of changes and additions being made to the anime version right before our eyes. Is the Thousand Year Blood War arc better written than the Soul Society arc, better paced? Again, the answer is no. However, if the Soul Society arc is the series distilled down to near perfection, then the Thousand Year Blood War arc is almost the total opposite. It is Bleach at its most ambitious, at its craziest, its most unrelenting, expanded beyond my wildest dreams, almost completely untamable, unmanageable, and yet I love it for that. The Thousand Year Blood War arc is Kubo unshackled, and that freedom comes through in droves. For a long-time weekly reader like myself, the Thousand Year Blood War arc felt completely new. It was truly exciting in a way the series had almost never been before. Spanning from chapter 480 to chapter 686, the Thousand Year Blood War arc is the second longest arc in the series. Yet it could not feel any more different to the Rankar arc. Earlier I criticised the Rankar arc for being so long, and yet none of the events that take place have a material effect on the world around them. Nothing changes, save for the fact that Aizen is displaced out of Waco Mundo, leading to some change over there, but guess what? You don't see the fruits of any of those changes until, you guessed it, the Thousand Year Blood War arc, which is really when it feels like the wider world of Bleach is allowed to progress, to move on. In a way, it was all for naught from a narrative perspective. I like to see tangible change in my narratives, evidence that these things took place. And the Thousand Year Blood War arc seems to be a laser-focused correction to that very criticism. Here, everything is on the table. Everything feels like it has consequences. The stakes are higher than they've ever been before because we are dealing at long last with the very biggest topics Bleach has to offer. Despite some of the execution, which we'll get to, none of the narrative concepts in the Thousand Year Blood War arc feel like a half measure. The Quincy are back, and now they have an enormous secret empire that's been living in the shadows of the Serete for the last 1,000 years. Oh, and they're being led by a genocidal god king, who also happens to be the son of the Soul King. Speaking of the Soul King, after what felt like years of dragging our feet, the Thousand Year Blood War arc finally deals in the most interesting concepts and plot threads of the story. Seriously, go back and look at the Rankar arc, specifically the narrative that's driving behind the wheel. There is nothing half as interesting taking place there as what the Thousand Year Blood War arc at least attempts to tackle. From the very biggest macro concepts like the Royal Palace, the Zero Division, and the end of the Three Worlds, to the smallest, most intimate stories, like the truth behind the meeting of Ichigo's parents, the Thousand Year Blood War arc is going all out from day one, and it pretty much never lets up. And you know what? Speaking of which, let's talk about some of the things the arc doesn't get right, because there is a lot. This arc is a mess. It's an honest, earnest mess, but a mess all the same. I never agreed with, or even really respected, the comments that said that Kubo had clearly kind of given up with this arc, because I just don't think it's true. I think the evidence is there right the way through to the end of the Varvelt arc that Kubo is still trying his hardest to bring readers a satisfying and interesting story. But obviously his body is giving out, and he was under multiple angles of pressure, and time was almost up. So I've never respected or agreed with that whatsoever, but the arc is an indisputable mess. The pacing is completely out of whack, but now on the opposite end of the spectrum to the Rankar arc. Things are now happening at a lightning fast speed, and it's almost impossible to keep up, or let things breathe and linger in a meaningful way. But I'll be honest, From my perspective as a reader, I prefer that, over how slow the Urankar arc felt in places. Comparing the two, the Urankar arc feels like it is wading through molasses. Sure, with the Thousand Year Blood War arc, we are starting a new scenario pretty much on average every 3 weeks, but hey, it keeps things interesting. And yes, that is a symptom, a sign of the fact that Kubo held so much back. The reason the Thousand Year Blood War arc is so fast is because nothing happens in the Irankar arc, that's why. But I prefer this, I like this, it's more interesting, and it keeps you on your toes. Is it ideal? No, but it's what we got, and I prefer it. But then there's perhaps the biggest sticking point of all. The Vandenreich, the newest villains, an empire of diabolical fascistic Quincy, including the Sternritter, an elite force designed to combat the captains of the Gotei 13, who zealously follow their all-father Yuhabak, maybe the single most influential new character added to the series since, well, Aizen, basically. And so let's begin with him. While I don't think Yuhabak was ever likely to be as good a main villain as Aizen, he was a huge breath of fresh air to begin with. He felt completely hands-on and brutal. Savage in a way Aizen never was. A true warlord who wasn't afraid of fighting on the front lines and getting his hands dirty, who wanted to conquer and dominate the Soul Society. Sadly, his ultimate motivations and his past were muddied, to say the least, in the manga, though the anime has gone a long way to fix those problems in particular, and the character does fall off for me in a pretty big way once he absorbs the Soul King and becomes much more passive. But he is still an incredible addition to the Bleach universe, one where it is now hard to imagine the story before Yuhabak was introduced. And of course, the twist that he is Zangetsu remains perhaps second only to Aizen's true nature as the craziest reveal of the series. Now let's just be real, the Sternritter were never going to be as popular or as iconic as the Espada. For starters, there's too many of them. Many of them are dispatched almost immediately with little to no characterization outside of the utmost superficial, while others feel uninspired or underutilized. For every Sternritter who feels like a meaningful character, Hashwolf, Askin, Basby, there are 2 who don't. And again, yeah, I get that. The Espada had an enormous impact on Bleach from a meta outsider perspective. But again, as a long-time weekly reader, the Vandenreich was almost exactly what I wanted from the villains of the final arc. Enemies who could actually finally challenge the captains, a military force designed to be able to lock horns with the Gotei 13 from a power perspective. Sure, aside from Kirge, many of them didn't really feel like the Quincy we had come to know, but when Asnod was eviscerating Byakuya with his own bankai, or Basby was taking Hitsugaya to the brink of a fiery death, it honestly didn't matter to me. But the Gotei 13 are once again the stars of the show here, and unlike the Urankar arc, they are actively taking an interesting role from the get-go, and that's again likely due to the immense pressure they are finally under. While Ichigo's friends, and to some extent Ichigo himself, are sidelined a little throughout this arc, there is no denying the Shinigami are, for the most part, I would say, handled superbly. Kyoraku comes alive in this arc with some of the best characterization I've ever seen in Bleach, completely transforming the character in the wake of his father figure's death. Speaking of which, for the brief time he's in the arc, Yamamoto is given more depth here than ever before, while Kenpachi is perhaps the truest winner, going on a full developmental journey throughout the arc. Rukia and Renji are finally given the respect they deserve and are put up on a pedestal alongside Ichigo. Komamura undergoes an unbelievable transformation that harkens back to his earlier development in the Urankar arc, and of course Aizen makes his long-awaited return after almost 200 chapters in prison. And then of course there's the art as well, which I think is quite interesting. The Thousand Year Blood War arc being so chock full of things going on at all times, being the war arc of Bleach, it does feel very busy. There's a lot going on, and as a result, Your average panel, your average picture doesn't quite have the same level of detail as, say, in the Lost Agent arc. There's a flatness to a lot of the art found in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, but again, I do quite like it. And also, Kubo does put out some of his very best artwork here, especially in the first half or so of the arc. I do think the base quality of the art falls off pretty badly within the last maybe 10 or so chapters, and that's quite clearly when Kubo was really feeling the strain. His body was really starting to fail him, he was injured, and it's sad because you can kind of see it. The artwork does suffer as a result, though he does kind of bring it back towards the very end for those final 2 chapters or so. But specifically in that final stretch of chapters, the detail takes a big hit. The panels are muddy, they're murky, sometimes it's hard to really see what's going on, and that is the complete antithesis of what Kubo's art had always been up until then. So that is kind of sad to see. But for the most part, I think the Thousand Year Blood War arc's artwork is, again, wonderful. It's a slightly more, I would say, matured version of what the Arankar arc was doing. That edge has been slightly brought back after it was almost completely removed in the Arankar arc. The dynamism has returned slightly. Things are very busy. It's not quite as clean as the Lost Agent arc, but it is interesting in its own right. But let's circle back around to the beginning, and to what really seals the deal for me as a reader and a long-time fan. It's this idea of change. It's events of this nature having a real-world effect around them. It makes it feel like what happened mattered to that universe. And the Thousand Year Blood War arc kind of has it all. Important deaths leading to major upheavals and changes of the guard, to restructuring the very Gotei 13 itself. Spoilers here, I guess, for the very end of the Thousand Year Blood War arc and for the Hell chapter, but in the epilogue, you can see just how much damage was done, and we don't even get to see everything. The new Soul King is missing in action. We don't know what's become of the Royal Palace just yet outside of Can't Fear Your Own World. I'm talking specifically about the manga. Big, big changes have happened. Everlasting changes that will reshape not only the Gotei 13, not only the Soul Society, but the worlds of Bleach in general. And that's important. And not only that, but actually the Thousand Year Blood War arc and the events therein do help to set up the Hell chapter, as the springboard for what appears to be that arc is the deaths of Yamamoto, Unohana, and Ukitake. But then there's also the total annihilation and replacing of the Serete with the Quincy's icy cityscape. The toppling of the royal palace, the killing of the Soul King, and the usurping of the throne by Yhwach, who completely transforms the palace itself. I mean, these are all enormous, earth-shattering events. These are the events we as fans and readers had been wondering about for the best part of a decade prior to this. Again, I cannot stress it enough. Absolutely nothing happens in the Arankar arc on this kind of a scale of any consequence to really change the world. Some of the Vizard are reinstated into the Gotei 13, which is cool, albeit you don't actually see that until the Lost Agent arc, but there you go. But no, as I said, and being completely fair, the Thousand Year Blood War arc isn't perfect. In fact, it gets a lot of things wrong, and ultimately drops the ball way more than the Soul Society arc, which by comparison doesn't really drop the ball at all. In the manga, Uryu is absolutely wasted in what really should be his arc. The ending, while I don't hate it, is totally rushed and leaves way too much unresolved on the table. In fact, I remember back in 2016 a disgruntled, even dismayed Tomo writing a list of everything that was still to be resolved when the manga ended in 2016. I simply couldn't believe it. The Stern Ritter are not as compelling as the Espada, but they are a hell of a lot more effective, and if that's the trade-off we have to make, then I think it's worth it. And while it does move at a very brisk pace, it also manages, I think, to successfully land many of its most emotional beats too. Byakuya's final conversation with Ichigo, the story of Everything But the Rain, and of course the incredible saga of Friend between Hashwalth and Basby, to name a few. Look, maybe this is reductive, right? But I can't help but think the Thousand Year Blood War arc is the arc made for Bleach fans. Despite its many issues, despite the elements that aren't satisfying, it feels like an arc that was written by a Bleach fan for Bleach fans. Like, if you are a long-time lover of Bleach, if you had been with the story, you know, ride or die, you are the person who will get the most out of this arc, even with its warts and all. And I think that's maybe why it is my favourite. It's the culmination of everything. I love seeing the different corners of the Bleach universe coming together. The remaining Espada, Grimjo, Nell. I love seeing the Fullbringers come back. Riruka, Yukio, and of course later Ginjo and Tsukishima, to fight this common enemy. All of that is so satisfying to me as a long-time Bleach fan, as a, you know, pretty self-confessed big Bleach fan. Maybe that is why this arc still manages to resonate with me so much, and I would be really curious to see what you think about that. But so above all else, for me, the Thousand Year Blood War arc is exciting, truly exciting. I can hold my hands up and say, in all my years of reading Bleach weekly, I was never more excited to read a chapter than during the first Quincy invasion. In my opinion, still the finest sequence of chapters from the manga's entire run. There is nothing better. It is basically perfect. Perfectly paced, the stakes are unimaginably high, conflicts are unfolding on multiple fronts that are actually impactful, that have a role to play on the wider narrative at the time, while the clock ticks down to doomsday. It is still unbelievable to me that Kubo got it so right, that it is so evocative. And while the rest of the arc admittedly never quite lives up to how well all of that played out, it's an absolute ride all the same. Bleach at its most ambitious and its most fearless. And for that, I just absolutely love it, faults and all. Alright everyone, but that's it for this, frankly absurdly long video, ranking, the definitive ranking of all 5 of the core Bleach story arcs from worst to best. Although again, calling Agent of the Shinigami arc the worst feels harsh to me, but them's the breaks. Those are the rules of said ranking video. I did want to go in depth with each of these arcs. I think talking about the story arcs from a holistic perspective is a pretty big deal, and so I wanted to give each of them their flowers, to treat each of them as fairly as possible, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Now, of course, I'm not expecting you to agree with me, really, at all. This is very much my own personal list, and so I'd love to hear yours down in the comments. I invite you, do please let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Maybe we do share some of the same placements. Maybe I'm completely off base. Either way, I'd love to know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. I need to end this thing before my camera dies. It is about to go. So I'll just end by saying a massive thank you to everyone who watched. As always, please consider hitting subscribe. If you haven't done already, check out Mr. Tomo Talks Games. Your support over there is really having a huge impact. And of course, a huge thank you before we go to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, who I could not do this without. Each and every one of you is making a massive difference, and frankly, you're helping to keep the channel alive here on YouTube when things aren't brilliant for creators. So again, I really do appreciate the continued support. Alright everyone, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.